Procurement, Getting It Right, brought to you by the Controllers Council. My name is Neil Brown, Executive Director of the Controllers Council. And before I introduce our expert speaker, I want to mention some brief housekeeping items and share a word about our sponsor. Okay, in regard to housekeeping, first we'll have a Q&A at the end of the presentation, so please use your GoToWebinar control panel to ask our expert questions. Next, this webinar is CPE eligible, 1 CPE credit. So we'll be having 3 polling questions. And again, use your GoToWebinar control panel to answer each poll and benchmark your peers if you're not trying to get CPE. In regard to CPE, please allow up to 1 week to receive your certificates from Bill.com. And finally, you'll receive a link to this webcast via email in the next 24 hours, so no need for taking a lot of notes or screenshots. So with that, I'd like to give you a word about our partner and sponsor, Bill.com. Bill.com, New York Stock Exchange, BILL, is a leading provider of cloud-based software that simplifies, digitizes, and automates financial operations for small and medium-sized businesses, or SMBs. Additional solutions include expense management platform Divvy and mobile invoicing product Invoice2Go. SMBs worldwide use Bill.com solutions to manage end-to-end financial workflows, payments, and to manage their cash inflows and outflows. Learn more at www.bill.com. So with that, I'm pleased to introduce our expert speaker and panelist, Aaron Burson. Aaron is a CPA and founder and CEO of Fringe Advisory, a New York-based fractional controller and CFO service, among other things. In addition, I'm pleased to introduce Joe Flesher of Bill.com that will moderate questions. Aaron and Joe, welcome.
Thank you very much, Neil, for the kind introduction. And as Neil mentioned, I'm Joe Fleischer with Bill.com. And before we begin, I'd like to summarize the topics we'll cover during our webinar. As you can see, we'll first consider how finance and procurement teams have traditionally separated their responsibilities and why these responsibilities overlap. Given the increasing intersection of finance and procurement, we'll turn our attention to the most significant challenges mid-sized organizations encounter as they strive to coordinate both. And then we'll consider and suggest how you can facilitate collaboration between finance and procurement, focusing with regard to finance on payables. Now, we had mentioned that throughout our webinar, we'll intersperse 3 polling questions. Before we begin our discussion with Aaron, I'll turn the floor over to Neil once again to pose the first of our 3 polling questions.
All right, thank you, Joe. So I will launch this poll. My organization has grown to the point that it requires a dedicated procurement function. Select one of the following. So this is a nice, easy one. Please take a few seconds to weigh in. And if you're not going for CPE, still vote so you can compare yourself to your peers. So we're getting excellent voting here, and we're almost completed. So with that, I will close the poll and share the results for your analysis.
Well, thank you very much, Neil. And it's intriguing to see that a overwhelming percentage, at the very least, agree. And certainly that's a good starting point for our webinar today. With 84% of respondents at the very least agreeing and nearly half strongly agreeing. So in this context, first of all, I want to thank our audience for responding to our first poll, and then I want to launch into our discussion. And Aaron, I would love to ask you, in your observation, what are the clearest indications that a growing company should establish a dedicated procurement function? Aaron, I'd love to hear your perspective on this question.
Sure. So, hi everyone. My name is Aaron Burson, as you already heard, but I think to just jump right in here and Neil, could you go to the next slide if you don't mind?
Yeah, the question. Okay. Oh,
Yeah,
we need.
yeah.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, so to answer this question, I like to look at 4 big areas when it comes to kind of the finance and operations functions to help people determine if they really do need a full procurement division or operation, or if they are able to get it done as a ancillary function of the finance department, right? And I think some of the biggest things that come into play here are, why are you looking at procurement, right? Is it because you actually have inventory that you're buying or other physical items that you're buying that you need to do three-way matching and reconcile to make sure that as those goods come in, you're not paying invoices prior to ensuring that those have actually been delivered to you? Or is it more around spend control and, you know, accuracy of the information? So I think when evaluating this, you really need to first step back and say, why do I need this, right? And procurement spans a broad spectrum, and we'll get into a little bit more of the detail of it as we go along. However, it could be as simple as purchase orders, you know, having an approval of a purchase order so that finance has a way to say, was this an approved spend when the invoice ultimately comes in? It could be a full procurement system where you're actually looking at online databases of products and items to purchase, creating requisition forms, purchase orders, ultimate, you know, invoices and receipt capture, all the way through bill payment. So there's a broad spectrum here. And as you first go through that process, I think it's very important to evaluate the why, right? Because you could get buried in the nuances and buried in implementing a system that's A to Z of procurement when really all you needed was a simple purchase order system because you wanted to just track approved spend on a few different projects, right? So I think that's one of the biggest things. As you continue to grow, and obviously the company size plays into this as well, that a lot of times multi-location enterprises with large teams that have, whether it be physical goods or purchase requisitions coming from all the different offices, that's usually one trigger also that would indicate that maybe we need a procurement function, or at the very least a purchase order function to manage that, because you have your accounting, you know, sitting at HQ, might not be involved at all in the day-to-day when it comes to what's going on in the individual locations, and needs some way to know that these are valid invoices that are coming in, versus when you were smaller, you know, finance probably was involved, or the one person in finance was probably involved in a lot of the day-to-day operations, or had, you know, very close connection to the CEO, if you will. I think expanding on that, though, one of the other big reasons why you might need procurement is if you're having accuracy issues in shipments being received of physical goods, or just issues with accurate bills being entered into the system. Because when you start to get into full procurement, you start to digitize a lot of this process, where historically, when you have bills that are being received or invoices being received that you have to key into the system or somehow get into a payable system, or maybe you're doing it manually, there's a lot of chances for error. When you start getting into a full procurement system, those pieces of data actually can never, or may very possibly never, leave an electronic platform, right? So in that context, for accuracy purposes, you eliminate human entry errors, because no human is ever entering anything, because all they are doing is working in their approved workflow of receiving the products, matching it up against purchase orders, assigning an invoice to it, and ultimately it flowing through to finance for payment approvals and payment disbursement, which would eliminate all, pretty much, of the accuracy issues, as well as you're involving a lot more people, so there's a lot more chances for accuracy errors to be caught. I will say that probably the most common reason I see people starting with procurement is not the third on the right here, but the left-hand one, of spend control, of just trying to get a rein on all the various spending going on within an organization, especially as it begins to grow and finance becomes less involved in day-to-day operations. I think that's probably the first point that I see people entering into this space. And to give a little bit more background of, who the heck am I and why does what I think matter? So like Neil introduced me before, founder of Fringe Advisory, outsourced CFO and controller shop. This is my third version of this same type of a practice. I built it at a top 20 firm, a top 200 firm, and then went off on my own and built up Fringe Advisory over the course of actually the pandemic. So it was perfect timing to start a practice, but actually turned out very well. And in that capacity, I also have worked with hundreds of different organizations across all different sizes, both on the accounting and enterprise side. So I've seen a fair bit of this, as well as in my travels to different conferences and consulting with other softwares and practitioners. I come across these challenges often. Just to give a little background of who I am and why I'm familiar with this type of stuff.